Right, if this is working, I want to thank you for being invited here. It was wonderful. I just came in yesterday from Boston in Massachusetts, and I'm very honored to be speaking here to you. What I'm going to do today is give you a little introduction of myself and the organization that I work for, and then a short history lesson of what things were like in the United States before we created a war on drugs in 1970, and what things are like in the United States today, and let you folks decide if you think this was a sensible policy or not. I spent, as you just heard, 26 years in the New Jersey State Police. 14 of those years was undercover in narcotics. I worked everything up to billion-dollar international heroin and cocaine rings, but that's not the way we started out, as you will hear. When I retired from that position, I felt very bad about my role in implementing what today I've decided is not only a just war on drugs, but it's much worse. It's a self-perpetuating, constantly expanding policy disaster. So I sat down with 4 other police officers, and we tried to decide what should law enforcement really be interested in doing. And when we boiled it down to the essence, we decided that we should be interested in reducing 4 things: deaths, disease, crime, and addiction. And sadly, folks, all 4 of those categories are just made infinitely worse by the war on drugs. So that definitely was not what we wanted. What we decided we do want, after much discussion, is reflected in the name of the organization we created, Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, or LEAP. What we decided is we want to end drug prohibition around the world, just like we ended alcohol prohibition in the United States in 1933. Because looking at this as law enforcers, we understand that the next day after we ended that nasty law, Al Capone and all his smuggling buddies were out of business. They were off our streets. They were no longer out there killing each other to control that very lucrative market. They were no longer killing us police officers charged with fighting that useless war. And they were no longer killing our children caught in crossfire and drive-by shootings. All the things we experience today. So we know that if we legalize these drugs, we can completely remove violence from the equation. And then when we regulate the drugs, we can do some other wonderful things which we'll discuss. End overdose deaths, prevent 50% of all new cases of AIDS and hepatitis. And then when we start treating drug abuse as a health problem instead of a crime problem, we know that we can help these young people whose lives were destroyed by arrest and imprisonment and actually bring them back into society. So we created this organization, the 5 of us. Today it's grown a little. It's no longer 5 cops. It's 30,000 people in 78 countries. And now we have police, judges, prosecutors, prison wardens, DEA and FBI agents, and we're all calling for the legalization and regulation of all drugs. Before I start on this little history lesson, let me suggest to you that I didn't come here by any means to tell you how to take care of your business, make your laws, or anything aside. It's this kind. I know you're perfectly capable of doing that. What I came here to say is to warn you actually, to beg you, don't follow the United States down the path to prohibition, because it's the path to destruction, the path to despair, the path to disaster. You know, we didn't always have an illegal drug in the United States. As a matter of fact, until 1914, there were no illegal drugs in the United States on the federal level. And as this ad from a grocery store from 1901 depicts, if you had $4.85 in your pocket back then, anybody could walk into a grocery store and buy an ounce of pure heroin. We hadn't turned into a nation of drugged out zombies then, and we're quite sure that if we re-legalize these drugs, we won't turn into that today. When you start to study the drug laws of the United States, you discover that they have a lot more to do with racism than they do with drug use. In 1914, of course, the race of choice for the Americans to despise was the Chinese. The Chinese whom we had invited to our country in the 1800s to build our railroads, because that was a very, very dangerous, deadly job to do that. And the real Americans didn't want to be caught doing that. But after the railroads were built, the Chinese sort of congregated up in the California area around San Francisco. And these real Americans said, well, they're taking our jobs away from us. Now, we couldn't deport them because we had invited them in. But if we had the right laws, we could certainly arrest them and imprison them. And we were quite sure that the first law that was created was aimed at the Chinese, because the first law, the forerunner to the law that I'm going to talk about, was created in San Francisco in 1909, and that law simply said, no Chinaman shall possess opium. So it's pretty evident who we were aimed at there. Now, when we created the federal law, we did remove Chinaman from the federal law in 1914, but we also knew that 99% of the people possessing opium were Chinese, so it accomplished the same thing. But this was a major thing in our country, a major change in everything that we had ever believed in. For the first time in our history, we had decided to say, what a person puts in their own body makes them a criminal. That's a big step. So in order to convince the public that this big step was necessary, our government said it did a study and it discovered that 1.3% of our population was addicted to those drugs. So we can't have that, we have to make these illegal. We passed the Harrison Anti-Drug Act of 1914, making opiates illegal. In the ensuing years, we passed a lot of other drug laws making other things illegal, and these were also based on race. I don't have time to get into them exactly right now. But let's fast forward ahead to 1970, 56 years. Come in, please. That's when I came into the picture. Actually, it was 1964 when I joined the New Jersey State Police. That picture in the upper left-hand corner is a picture of when I graduated that year. And underneath it is more or less a picture of when I graduated from their narcotic bureau. Actually, that's one of the better pictures. I try to keep the bad ones off of there. The rest are just different pictures of me in undercover positions. It was 1970 when I went into narcotics. 1970 was the beginning of the war on drugs. The war on drugs was actually coined and created by Richard Milhouse Nixon in 1968. And again, it had nothing to do with drugs. It had everything to do with the fact that he was running for the presidency of the United States for the second time, and he thought this time it would really be nice if he could win. he knew if he was a strong anti-crime guy, it'd give him a lot of votes. But boy, if he could be in charge of a war on drugs, how those votes would pour in. And he was right, it worked. So he was elected. Also, folks, it had a lot to do with racism, and we're pretty sure of that, because the first state that any presidential campaigner goes to campaign in is New Hampshire. And when Mr. Nixon went to New Hampshire, he did so well there on the campaign that he wrote a letter to his mentor, Eisenhower, who he had served as vice president under. And he said, "Ike, it's unbelievable what you can do with fear." He said, "All I talk about here in New Hampshire is drugs and crime, and everybody wants to vote for me. And Ike, they don't even have black people up here." So you get an idea of where he was going. And sure enough, when he was voted in office, in his first year in office, 1969, H.R. Haldeman, who was his chief of staff, came from a meeting with the president, and he sat down at his own desk afterwards and took out his personal diary, and he wrote in it, "I just left a meeting with Mr. Nixon, and the president said," and he's got it in quotes, "the real problem in this country is the blacks. And the trick is how to get at that problem without anyone realizing that's what you're doing." Unquote. As far as I'm concerned, his answer to that problem was the war on drugs. Because it has literally devastated the black community in the United States. Well, this was an even larger step than the step we took in 1914. Not only are we going to say, what you put in your body will make you a criminal, but now we're going to start a war on you. So the government said, we've got to show the public that this is necessary. They did a survey, and they discovered that 1.3% of the population was addicted to drugs, said we can't have that, we've got to start a war. Well, war was probably a pretty poor choice of policies. Because if you go back to 1970 and you look at the statistics from that year, you will find that the likelihood of anybody dying as a result of the drug culture in the United States was less than the likelihood of them dying from falling down the steps in their own house. It was less than the likelihood of them choking to death on their own food at dinner. But we started a war on drugs. You see, we really didn't have much of a drug problem in the United States in 1970. What little drug problem we did have was mainly soft drugs. Marijuana, hashish, some LSD, psilocybin, the mushrooms, the mind-bending drugs. Hard drugs such as heroin, cocaine, methamphetamine were virtually unheard of in 1970. Certainly unheard of compared to what they are today. And to show you how unheard of they are, here's a chart that I downloaded from DEA's own website. That's the Federal Drug Enforcement Administration, the people that are going to save us from this drug problem. It talks about heroin price and purity. And this is a very interesting chart. Running off to your left is the price on average that it would cost one heroin user to get high one time on that drug in each of these years from 1980 to 1999. And DEA has kindly adjusted all these prices back to $1980 so you can see what they really look like without inflation getting in the way. Running off to the right is the purity level, how strong that little packet of powder that they were buying was, how much of it was actually heroin. Now, as I told you, I started in 1970, so I can back this up 10 years. When I started buying heroin on the streets, we bought what were called tray bags, because they cost $3 a bag. And we always bought them in multiples of 2. By the way, a $3 bag of heroin in 1980 was the equivalent or in 1970, it was the equivalent of $6.37 in 1980 dollars. And we had to buy 2 each time. The reason we had to buy 2 is that's what the heroin users were doing. Because they had to cook up both bags and shoot them at the same time to get high at once. And of course, the reason they had to do that is, as I told you, hard drugs were almost unheard of in the United States at that time. In order to have enough heroin to go around, it was coming in at 1.5% pure. But you can see, according to DEA, after 10 years of fighting that war, the purity level had more than doubled, and the price had already dipped to $3.90. And after 30 years of our putting our heart and soul into this battle, the price had plummeted to an equivalent of 80 cents in 1980 dollars. And the reason it was so relatively cheap to get high on heroin by 1999 was that street-level heroin was coming in at 38% pure. Now, folks, that is a problem 25 times greater than it was at the beginning of the war. Let's talk about how many drug users of any kind of drug we have in the United States. According to DEA, when we started this war, they estimated we had about 4 million people in the United States above the age of 12 who had ever used an illegal drug. If you go back and you factor that into the population at that time, you find that was 2% of that possible population. Today, DEA is telling us we have 112 million people above the age of 12 who've used an illegal drug. That's 46% of that population. 2% to 46%, and we got there under a war on drugs. Looks like we're going the wrong direction, many folks. How about the money we spent on this war? That first year, Mr. Nixon thought he really wanted to see this work, so he put a lot of money in it. He dumped, just on the federal level, he dumped $100 million in it. That was a lot of money in 1970. I'll tell you what that money bought him. When I joined the New Jersey State Police in 1964, we had 1,700 troopers. We had a 7-man narcotic unit. Always seemed perfectly adequate for the job we needed to do in that state. And 6 years later, we still had exactly those same numbers. Until October of 1970, when I went in, when thanks to these massive funding bills that Nixon had got our Congress to pass, that would give tremendous amounts of money to any police department willing to hire officers to fight this war on drugs. We went from a 7-man unit to a 76-person narcotic bureau. Overnight, one step. Now, when you increase the size of any organization by 11 times its size, you set up a great deal of expectation. But when you take a police organization that's doing one job and you create an organization 11 times its size in one step, the next year we were expected to make at least 11 times more drug arrests than we did the year before. And we were literally off to the races. Well, this price tag has creeped up a little bit over the 40 years of the war on drugs. If you include the money spent on the federal, the state, local, and county level, it is now topping $70 billion a year. That's a lot of money. You'd think for that kind of money, at the very least, we would have less drugs in our country. Not so. When I was a young cop, kicking in doors and seizing these hard drugs with or without a warrant, we didn't care too much about that stuff back then. A good seizure for a local or a state cop might be 1 ounce of cocaine or 1/4 of an ounce of heroin. We called that weight in 1970, and if you made very many seizures like that, you got promoted. Look what we're seizing today, though. You all know what we're seizing today. Multiple tons, individual shipments of multiple tons of these hard drugs. By 2002, the largest that I saw out there was 10 tons, 10 tons of heroin, 20 tons of cocaine, one shipment. And folks, nothing changed on the streets, except those drugs kept getting cheaper, more potent, and far easier for children to access. And when I say cheaper, I really mean cheaper. According to DEA, the wholesale price for cocaine has dropped 60% since the beginning of the war. The wholesale price for heroin is down 70% since the beginning of the war. Now, if that war was doing anything at all constructive, those prices would be going up, not down. Let's talk about heroin overdoses. It seems to me if there's any way you should judge the efficacy of a policy, it's, are we saving lives? Well, from the beginning of the war up till about 1979, we had 28 overdose deaths per 100,000 heroin users. But by 2000 up to today, that has increased to 141 deaths per 100,000 users. Folks, that's a five-fold increase. Again, we're going the wrong direction. Excuse me. Let's talk about how many people we arrest. In my country, this is a chart just for arrests of non-violent drug offenders. From 1970 to 2005, not much has changed after 2005. Pretty stagnant. Before 1970, you could count the numbers of people arrested in my country for nonviolent drug offenses in the tens of thousands. The high tens, but still the tens of thousands. But in 1970, when we increased the number of police doing that by up to 11 times its size, that year we kicked it up to 415,000 arrests. And that number creeped up slowly over the next 10 years. By 1980, we were arresting a little over 500,000 people for nonviolent drug offenders. How many people do you have in Oslo, folks? What's your population? That's how many we were arrested in 1980, right? Just to give you an idea of what we're talking about here. But in 1980, two things happened that made this a self-perpetuating and constantly expanding policy disaster. The first thing was the politicians got into it. And they said, you cops are doing a great job, but you know, if you arrest a few more people, we promise we will back you 100%. We will create the harshest laws that have ever existed. Mandatory minimum sentences, 3 strikes, you're outlaws. You only have to deal with these people a couple times, they'll go to prison for life, case closed, problem solved. And we said, we'll try that. Nothing else seems to work, we'll try that. And at the same time, we got a new president, 1980. Probably remember who that fellow was, Ronald Reagan. And by the way, the two presidents I've talked about here are both Republicans. Don't get the idea that this is a Republican problem. This is the most nonpartisan policy disaster I think that's ever existed in the United States. Every president since Nixon, whether Democrat or Republican, has made the policy far worse than it was with his predecessor. For instance, under Clinton, more people were imprisoned, were arrested and imprisoned than in all of our history up till the time they went into office. So it is a nonpartisan operation. But Mr. Reagan liked what we were doing. He said, you cops are doing a great job. He said, but you know, you're going about this from the wrong angle. You've got to think about this like it's an economics equation, supply and demand. He said, you're on the supply side arresting dealers when you should be on the demand side, arresting users. Because if you arrest enough users, you'll frighten them away, and if there aren't any users out there, of course, there won't be any dealers. And we said, well, that has some sort of ring of logic to it. We'll try that. Give it a try. Well, folks, that was their downfall. You can see how rapidly arrests increased. By 20 years later, we quadrupled the number of people we were arresting. By 2005, we kicked it up to 1.9 million people. And look what we're arresting them for. 44% of those arrests are for marijuana violations. And because we were told don't just arrest dealers, arrest users, 89% of the marijuana arrests are for possession. And we're doing everything we can do to destroy those folks' lives. Last year we arrested 847,000 people for marijuana violations. But I would really like you to get the idea of what we're talking about here. 1.9 million people every year. But what's the population of Norway? 4.5 million Norwegians. Okay. About 2.25 years, we arrest that many people in the United States. Just arrested and imprison as many as we can possibly imprison. We have 2,400,000 people in prisons and jails in the United States right now. Far more per capita than any country in the world. I want this to sink into what we're doing, to how many people we're doing it. We have a saying at Lee, you can get over an addiction. You will never get over a conviction. A conviction will track you every day for the rest of your life because it's on a computer. You can move to another state, you can even move to another country, and it doesn't matter. Every time you go to apply for a new job, that record's over your head like a big, ugly cloud. That prospective employer looks at that record and says, hey, Truggy, we don't want you. As a matter of fact, the only place you were wanted then is right back in the drug culture, the very group we say we're trying to save you from. And we're so harsh, much more harsh even than your country, and that's why I'm saying, please don't follow us. If we catch a young person, say a 20-year-old man or a woman, with a marijuana cigarette, we can catch them in their own bedroom. Doesn't matter. The first thing we're going to do to them is we're going to take away their driver's license. Now, if you live in suburban or rural America, we don't have public transportation in my country. You take somebody's driver's license, that means they can no longer be gainfully employed. They can no longer feed their family. They can no longer get to college if they want to better their lot in life. And if they're in a position where somebody else can drive them to college, we've thought of that too. And in 1998, we passed the National Education Act, which says that if you're caught with so much as one marijuana cigarette, you can go to college, yeah, but you can't get a loan or grant from the government to go there. So you've got to pay your own way. So it's not, my point is, it's not just the person who gets arrested that's being sucked into this whirlpool. It's their entire family. The family that's paid for the lawyer's bills and the family that's worried about how they're going to feed themselves because suddenly their breadwinner can't be employed. And when these people come out of prison and they can't get a job and they have no education, we sit back and we scratch our heads and say, I wonder why they didn't quit using drugs. It's been 40 years now that we've fought this war. And we spent a total of about $1.5 trillion on the war. Here's what we got to show for that money. This is a chart of the cumulative arrests from the beginning of the war in 1970 up until, actually, not until today, just until 2007. 39 million arrests and counting. 39 million people whose lives we're trying to destroy. That's a lot of money to waste, and that's a lot of lives to waste, folks. But at least we've had some effect on the number of people addicted in my country, because today only 1.3% of the population. That's right, this is the only statistic that it hasn't changed in 100 years. 1.3% of the population was addicted when drugs were completely legal. 1.3% were addicted after 56 years of them being illegal when we're getting ready to start a war on it, and 1.3% today after this 40 years of bloody war. But you know, there's some stats that have changed dramatically in this time period, such as these. This is the clearance rate for major crimes in the U.S. That means the amount of crimes that were solved by our police officers. And of course, if this is the clearance rate, the opposite of that is the unsolved crimes. 40% of murders in my country are unsolved. 60% of rapes and arsons are unsolved. 75% of robberies go unsolved in my country. And if you want to commit a property crime, you're almost guaranteed to walk. 83% of property crimes are unsolved. Let me point out to you that in 1963, before we had a war on drugs, our police were correctly credited with solving 91% of our murders. Today we solve 61%. What could possibly make this tremendous change? We have far more police per capita than we had in 1963. They're better trained, better educated, better paid. They have technology at their disposal that we never even imagined in 1963. So how could they be solving 30% fewer murders? Well, the cops, judges, and prosecutors at LEAP believe it's because with the start of the war, we spend so much of our police staff and time and energy chasing around these non-violent drug offenders that we no longer have time to protect our citizens from violent predators, from child molesters, from things that really count. And we say, let us get back to doing these things that are really important. How's Prohibition changed our drug use in our schools in the United States? Well, for the last 10 years, our children in high school is the equivalent of what here? It's what? Okay. Our children in high school have reported that it's easier to buy illegal drugs than it is to buy beer and cigarettes. Now, why would that be, you think? Excuse me? Our children in high school have reported for 10 years that it is easier to buy illegal drugs than it is to buy beer or cigarettes. Why do you think that is? Exactly. Beer and cigarettes are regulated commodities. And if a young person goes into a regulated location that we say we can sell those only to adults, somebody will say to him, hey, are you old enough to buy this dope? Let me see an ID. Now you know that doesn't happen on the street corner, yes sir?
Which addicted do that?
With what?
Do that if they have any doubt about how old they are, they say no safety.
Exactly. They throw them out. It's over. Now, you know that doesn't happen down on the street corner. And it certainly doesn't happen with the 900,000 teenagers who, according to DEA, are selling drugs in my country. 900,000. Selling drugs mainly to other teenagers. They're not going to ask for an ID. They want to know one thing. Show me the money. And as soon as they've seen that money, it doesn't matter if that child is 4 years old, they're going to get the drugs. Because we have recorded cases of exactly that happening. So how much money are we talking about here, folks? Spent around the world on illegal drugs in a year. Enough to bribe a cop? You bet. My country, it happens regularly. Enough to buy a politician or a judge? Again, regularly in my country and even more regularly in some other countries. Enough to convince a banker to wash that dirty money through their own banks. In just the banks in the southern half of one of our 50 states, and just in Florida, in 1 year, $7 billion washed through. Folks, we're not talking about enough money spent on illegal drugs to buy a cop. We're talking about enough money to buy whole nations. $500 billion a year. That's a lot of money. You know how I know that's a lot of money until, I think it was 2 years ago, that was $100 billion more than the United States defense budget. And the U.S. defense budget is larger than the next 13 countries closest to us combined. That's a lot of money. Now, I can't even get my mind around how much is 1.9 million people. I certainly can't quite figure out how much is $500 billion. And I figured it might be a little hard for you too, so I brought you a little visual aid here. This next picture is a picture of a mere $255 million that we seized from one Mexican drug dealer. And it's in $100 bills. Let me suggest to you, to have a room full of $100 bills that would amount to $500 billion, you would need a room 2,000 times that size. You're talking some real money. Do you know this is true? Drug lords don't count their money anymore? Really? They weigh it. Yeah. $1 million in $100 bills weighs 37.1 pounds. They just weigh it, they put it on pads, and they pick it up with forklifts, and they say, there's 200 million, there's another 200 million. That's how fast it's coming in. Let me summarize, and I'll take questions now after I summarize it. And then, once we get an idea where you stand on this, then we'll go on to talk about solutions, because some real good solutions exist out there. What I've said is for the last 40 years, we have fought the longest war in the history of the United States, the war on drugs. We've arrested 1.9 million people a year. We've created the fastest growing prison industry in the world, made building prisons the fastest growing construction thing in our country for a 20-year period. Today, we got so many prisoners and so many prisons, we can't even afford to build them anymore. And despite all this money spent and all these lives destroyed today, as I just pointed out, drugs are cheaper, they're more potent, and they're far easier for our children to get. Now that is the very essence of a failed public policy. Which brings me right back to what I said at the first. That is why we want to end drug prohibition, like we ended alcohol prohibition, remove the violence, stop the overdose deaths, stop the diseases that are being spread, and keep it out of the hands of our children. So I'll take questions. Yes, sir. You got to speak pretty loud for me. Okay, the question is, and thank you, I'll have it. Thank you. Yes. The question was, we're very good at economic figures in the U.S. and how come, with all these facts at hand, nobody's done anything about this in all these years, right? Well, the reason is there's so much money to be made. $70 billion a year goes into our police departments every year, basically. All the police overtime in the United States is paid for by the war on drugs. And that's before you even start counting things like the money that comes in from the forfeiture laws. Are you folks aware of the forfeiture laws in the United States? No? Let me explain what the forfeiture laws are. Forfeiture laws were originally created back in 1800s, and they were created so that when we caught the ship of a pirate, we could seize that ship and they would forfeit it, so that we were taking away not just their money, but their property, and keeping them from pirating more things. In 1986, that was upgraded to include drugs. And the idea was these huge drug lords that have their own air force, literally. We could go in and we could seize their planes, we could seize their cars and their boats and all that. But as happens with most laws, once it's in place, it got used for things other than it was supposed to be used for. And when we started, somebody said, well, let's bring back the forfeiture laws, and we were stopping a lot of very expensive cars on our roads and finding 50 kilos of cocaine or something in the trunk. So we said, if we do this, we can not only take the cocaine, we can seize their car and hurt them a little bit, and we can seize any money that's in the car. So we started doing that. And the way the forfeiture laws are set up, half of any of the money that comes in goes to the police department that made the seizure, and half of it goes to the district attorney that's going to prosecute the case. So we started seizing cars, and once we had those cars, we would give the cars to our undercover agents. Like I used to drive a rather expensive car. Mercedes and BMWs and all these really hot cars. But after a while, all of our undercover agents had these great cars, and we kept seizing the cars. So we said, well, why should our plainclothes detectives be driving around in a Ford when they could be driving around in one of these hot cars too? So we gave them all these cars. And then we said, the cars kept coming. And we said, well, gee, why should our chief of police drive around in a Ford Crown Victoria when we could be driving a Lincoln Town car? So we started giving our chiefs and then our majors and our captains cars. Pretty soon everybody had cars, and the cars kept coming. So then we said, we'll put them on the auction block and we'll sell them, and we'll get the money. We did that. And then somebody said, hey, this is working so well with cars, let's start seizing people's houses. So if somebody got a shipment in of 100 kilos of cocaine, we'd seize their whole house. And then it was a shipment of 10 kilos of cocaine, and then it was a shipment of 10 pounds of marijuana, and then it was a shipment of 1 pound of marijuana, and we would seize their house. Until finally, a prosecutor said in open court that if we were to catch the owner of the Empire State Building in the lobby with a marijuana cigarette in his pocket, we'd seize the entire Empire State Building. It's literally a license to steal, folks. And there's uncountable billions of dollars that comes in from this. So this is still going to the question of why they're doing it. It's money. It's all about money. Everything's about money. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Yes. You're obviously talking about high corruption here, and we all know, I think, that the ban on cannabis in Norway stems from the initiative of the USA for the 1961 convention. So you're exporting this corruption, and we are living with it. My question to you is, how can we fight back? We are pretty small here and underfunded compared to the funds you just mentioned. What can we do? We are victims of your drug war.
First off, I wasn't talking about corruption. All this stuff is legal that I've talked about so far. The police corruption and corruption of all public officials is something on top of that. You know? And that is so huge. The temptation is so great. It's to me, I wonder why we don't have even more police that are corrupt. Most of our police aren't. But the temptation is so huge. Let me tell you a quick story about one of our troopers, and this happens fairly regularly. One of our troopers, New Jersey State Police, driving down the turnpike at night, nobody around, and he stops a car. I forget why he even stopped it. Had one person in the car, the driver, and on the back seat there was a valise, a large valise there. And for some reason he opened it. I don't know why that happened. But inside the valise was a little bit more than $250,000. So he says to the driver, "Where'd this money come from?" The driver says, "What money?" The trooper says, "The money in this valise." He says, "What valise?" So of course what he's saying is, if you let me drive down the road, I don't know that that money ever existed. All that trooper had to do was put it in his trunk, take it home, and he's $250,000 richer. And it will never be reported. Well, he turned it in. But that's the kind of temptation that's out there. For somebody working narcotics like I was, one of those pictures you saw in the middle here, I was sitting there over some suitcases full of money, that was $360,000. I was alone in the house with that $360,000. You know, where people go wrong is maybe they're put in a position like that. In their back pocket, they got a bill from the plumber for $3,800 that they didn't know how they were going to pay it. And they figure, none of this matters anyway, because every year it gets worse. We're not solving anything. So they take a little of the money. And then they're on that downward spiral. That's a corruption type thing. But what I said before wasn't corruption. That's just the money that's involved and the reason this continues. What can you do? The best thing I think anybody can do that's interested in stopping this is join LEAP, become a member. We have 30,000 members in 78 countries. We want to have 1 million members in the next 2 years. We have 100 speakers. To be a speaker or a board member, you have to be current or former law enforcement. But anybody can join us. And we don't ask for dues or fees. There's no meetings to attend. We don't release the names of anybody that joins us because we get joined by working police officers, working DEA and FBI officers, working politicians. But what we do is we count them. And when we get 1 million people who are members of this grassroots organization, we can go to the legislature and we can say, look, you're not going to lose one more vote than you're going to gain by supporting these policies. And at that point, we can start actually changing things, yes?
As far as I understand, you've got...
That's suspect.
Thank you. As far as I understand, you've got different drug policies in different states in America, right?
Well, it's basically all the federal policy, but yes, there are different, on the lower level, there's different
Are you
policies.
able to make any meaningful comparisons, say, from the severity of sentences from from state to state, or are they all federal laws?
The drug laws were basically all federal until some states decided that they were going to lower some of these repressive laws. And we now have 14 states and Washington, D.C., who have voted to decriminalize all drugs. Or not all drugs, I'm sorry, to decriminalize marijuana. And what that usually looks like is 1 ounce of marijuana is no longer a criminal act, like we just passed a law, an initiative, such as this in my state in Massachusetts in November 2008. And we made possession of 1 ounce of marijuana a civil infraction with a straight $100 fine. No criminal attachment whatsoever. There's another 14 states in my country that have legalized medical marijuana. So they're changing the laws, but the laws were originally all federal laws, okay? And because they were originally all federal laws, the federal people feel like they can go into the states, even though we've legalized medical marijuana, and arrest people who are using medical marijuana. They've been doing it. DEA has been doing that for years. With the Obama administration, when they went in, they said they're no longer going to do it. But it was mostly just words because they still are doing it. Yes, sir.
In the last 30 years in Norway, it's been a direct link between the heroin traffic to Norway and the wars going on around the world. Like in the 90s, it was Yugoslavia, and then the UCK, I think. All the drug addicts on the street were paying for their weapons. And today it's Taliban. What do you think about the future regarding to that question?
I seldom ever talk about this because when you talk about things on an international basis, the US CIA always gets involved, and if you talk about it, you end up being labeled as a conspiracy nut. But if you want to study a little bit about this, there's a book that I would highly recommend, written by a wonderful scholar, Alfred McCoy. He wrote a book called The Politics of Heroin. And it explains to you very clearly what you're talking about. The CIA, when it was created in my country in 1947, one of the first roles it had was we sent it to France because France was involved in a deadly fight between what was the former French underground that helped us fight against the Nazis, and the Corsican Mafia for the port city of Marseille. We sent our CIA there to support who? The Mafia. And of course, thanks to that support, the Mafia won, and for the next 25 years, Marseille became the largest distributor of heroin to the United States, anywhere in the world, known as the French Connection. And the next year, they were off to another location, another location, another location. It's happened right through history. It happened over in those countries we're at war with now, in Afghanistan. When the Russians came in to invade Afghanistan, our CIA was dumping $500 million a year into supporting the Mujahideen. Well, you can't run a war for a day on $500 million. So they were also looking the other way while the Mujahideen was selling the only product they had, heroin, in my country, and using that money to buy guns to fight that war. If we legalize and regulate these drugs, a lot of things will happen. Okay. I don't think I'm going to get a chance to go on with the solutions because we're down to a critical point here where I got to shut up. But let me just suggest to you, without going to the PowerPoint, every country that has done anything to lower these repressive laws has a better situation than they did before they created the better laws. There's a lot of countries that have decriminalized drugs. They would like to legalize drugs, but they can't because of the U.S. Because we would come down on them at least with economic sanctions, if not something else. I don't know how many of you are aware of it. Portugal decriminalized all drugs 8 years ago. And the outcomes of that are fantastic. Not only did they decriminalize all drugs, they said that if you can possess up to 10 days supply and you won't get arrested. So almost nobody gets arrested over there. You think it caused chaos. The opposite is true. Since they decriminalized, drug use in every age group has declined, especially among the young. For children from 13 to 15 years old, drug use has declined by 25%. For children young people from 16 to 18 years old, it is down by 22%. They're still using that same nasty drug that they don't know what the potency is because it's illegal. So you'd think that overdoses would be up at the same rate they are, but they're not. They've declined. Overdose deaths from heroin have declined by 52% since decriminalization. And the reason they say that has happened is they no longer are treating their drug users as criminals. It's a health problem. So these people are not afraid to take their friends who are overdosing for help. They've cut overdose deaths by 52%. Think of the lives that are being saved. New cases of HIV reported by drug users, intravenous drug users in Portugal, are down by 71% since they decriminalized. And interestingly enough, HIV cases for non-drug users is exactly where it was 8 years ago. So these things are working. Let me just tell you about one more country. Switzerland started a policy 15 years ago. They said, we're tired of arresting our children for making the mistake of using heroin. And they set up clinics all around the country where if you're a heroin user, you can actually go in there up to 3 times a day and inject that drug, and it's government-issued drug, so they know what they're taking. Using clean needles under medical supervision. There's job specialists, educators, social workers there to wean them off the drugs, and about 20% of those people quit using any kind of drug. And they say the reason it's so high in my country, 3 or 5% is all we get out of rehabs that quit. The reason it's so high is they're no longer treated as a criminal. They're treated as someone with a health problem, which means once they clean up, it's much easier for them to go back and get their life back. There hasn't been one overdose death there in 15 years. Think of the lives that were saved. AIDS and hepatitis, Switzerland used to be one of the highest countries in Europe. It's dropped it to the lowest per capita rate of any country in Europe because these people are no longer sharing needles. Crime was cut by 60%. Now these drugs are being supplied on a sliding scale, but if you have no money, the drugs are free. So a heroin user, to pay for their drugs, doesn't have to break into your house and steal your television set or do something worse. And because the drugs are effectively free, there's no dopers on the streets where these projects are selling heroin. You can't beat free. What fool would buy from you, right? And if the dopers aren't out there and they're not killing each other, cops or kids, so all the violence is gone. And maybe even more important than that, for those people that think if we legalize these drugs, we'd have more drug users. There was just a 10-year study done on this project by the very prestigious medical journal in Britain, the Lancet, and that study shows an 82% decline in new heroin users in Zurich. 82% less. Think of that. Almost every other country in the world has registered more heroin users than we thought we'd have. Here's 82% less, and you know why they say that's happening? Because the drug dealers are no longer in the neighborhoods rubbing shoulders with the young people to convince them, lure them into picking up that needle, or to make them think that they can make a lot of money by selling these drugs. That stuff no longer exists. So the Swiss people have figured out a way to reduce death, disease, crime, and addiction. All the 4 things that Leaf is after. And folks, this is the closest thing we have to legalization in the world. Thank you.